And welcome back. I hope you've all been doing well. So we have a video today that's kind of not scheduled. It's sort of an impromptu video, and it was motivated by a few very good questions asked by a poster in one of the comment sections of a video. And in fact, it was the video for episode 31 of our Steam Library playthrough. I'm not sure who the person is, if it even is a person, given the name of the account and the fact that the account's only about a week and a half old, 2 weeks old, give or take. But I'm going to give them the benefit of a doubt and go ahead and answer these questions because they are actually very good questions. So the questions that I want to cover are these three here. The poster is asking about Nabara Linux and its focus on gaming and modding, and asking if modding is as easy on Linux as it is Windows. And they're also asking too on why it feels complicated and difficult to install Linux. And they mentioned the YouTubers experience videos, and we'll cover that in detail. And they ask what the best distro is for beginners. So these are actually three very good questions, and we'll go ahead and tackle those in this video. So again, this is an impromptu video. It was not on the schedule for today. The video on the schedule today was actually the tour of the Cosmic Desktop environment, and that video is still coming. But I really want to take a moment, just because I was so motivated, to go ahead and answer these questions the best that I can. So anyway, so some of the answers may seem a bit rough around the edges, but they're just my honest and genuine opinion. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and jump into it. All right, so the first question the poster asked was about the best distro for someone who wants to switch to Linux, and it has to be gaming friendly and an easy distro to use. To answer that question, I kind of want to go through a few things here. So first of all, there is no one size fits all answer to this question. It all depends on the individual who's making the switch. Questions like, what is their level of technical skill? Are they someone who, for just an example, digs down deep into their Windows installation? Someone who can use the command prompt, navigate their file system, install and maintain their hardware drivers without an app doing it for them, even know what a driver is and what it does? Are they someone who knows the difference between an admin account and a user account? Are they someone who can troubleshoot and fix issues on their own? Or are they someone who's completely opposite and can barely operate the system other than surfing the web, watching cat videos, and checking their email? Are they absolutely and legitimately tied to a Windows-only app where there is no alternative in Linux and or cannot be run through a hypervisor? Are they concerned about security and privacy, or maybe they just don't care? You know, one of those bro if you've got nothing to hide types. I say all this without any negative connotations because, quite frankly, there's absolutely nothing wrong with not being a nerd and living on your PC. I say this as someone who is a nerd and does live on my PC. But anyway, back to the point. Making a distro recommendation is not as cut and dry as just telling them to use your favorite distro and washing your hands of it and calling it a day. So what distro would I recommend to someone making the switch for the first time? If I'm making the switch to someone who isn't tech savvy, and after talking with them and getting to know them a little bit and asking them some questions, a person who isn't interested in compiling their own kernels and just wants to use their computer in the same way that most people do, you know, surfing the web, watching Rave 7442 videos on YouTube, looking up recipes, checking the weather, and so on, I would recommend either Pop! OS, Ubuntu, or maybe Mint. If there's someone like who I just described that happens to be a hardcore PC gamer, I might even recommend Nabara, or maybe even Catchy OS, depending on their level of technical skill and knowledge. On the other hand, if there's someone who's adept at technology, like the first person I described earlier, I might recommend they try Arch as their first distro. And if they're a super nerd, I might even suggest Gentoo. But let's be real here, if their level of tech knowledge is already that high, they're probably already on Linux. For one more point to consider is how willing are they to learn something new? That's a huge one. As much as it pains me to say this, and again without trying to sound too negative, it seems that most people today aren't interested in learning anything that can't be explained in a 30-second TikTok. But I don't want to turn this into a rant, so I'll leave that alone. If they are someone really into learning and trying new things, again, they might be a good candidate for Arch. On the other hand, if they're someone who loses interest in something if it can't be explained in a TikTok, they probably should avoid Linux and just stick with Windows or Mac. Otherwise, maybe one of the big three new user-friendly distros I mentioned earlier, like Pop, Mint, and Ubuntu. All right, so I hope that answers the question, and we'll move on to the next one. All right, so the next question, the poster was asking about my feelings on Nabara and about its focus on gaming and whether or not modding in Nabara Linux is as easy as it is Windows. First, let's say that Nabara is a fantastic distro and the result of work done by Thomas Kreider, the same person who is behind building and supporting Proton GE. Let's start with a little background on Nabara. Now, I was going to make a really bad joke here about Nabara being a 16-year-old female student at Tokyo Jiu-Jitsu High, but then I realized how absolutely cringy that would be, so I decided not to ruin the video, so you're welcome. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Nabara. It is a distro based on Fedora, but it is not a spin on Fedora, and was again created by Thomas Kreider, who is an engineer at Red Hat. Nibbara was released in 2022 and uses GNOME and KDE Plasma as its default desktop environments. It uses DNF and Flatpak for its package manager. And you can Google for more details if you'd like, and I would encourage you to do so if you're considering using it. So what do I think about Nibbara? I think it's great. It's a solid distro for not just everyday use, but also for gaming. I personally think, as a matter of opinion, that Nibbara is a solid combination of bleeding edge and stability. My only concern, and for the record, this is not a critique, nor is this a concern meant to be taken as a negative, because it's not. My concern is that Thomas is pretty much the only one maintaining the distro, and it could potentially disappear overnight if he ever decided to drop the project completely. Now, sure, chances are really good that the community would step up and take over, but at least for me, it's still a little bit of a concern. Now, there could be a contingency plan that I'm not aware of, so if someone out there knows, please let me know in the comments. To answer the second part of the question, I'm not much of a modder. Don't get me wrong, I think mods are great, and I'm glad that there are people out there with the passion and the skill and talent to make mods. In some cases, they're actually better than some of the developers working on the games, but I've never been one to use them. Again, I have absolutely nothing against them. I think the only mods I have ever used were back in my World of Warcraft days when we used to use mods to record and monitor our DPS, if that could even be considered a mod. Because I don't use mods historically, other than a couple of times in my WoW days, you might want to check out someone like Michael Horn. He has a really good video titled Modding Games on Linux, so check that out. I wish I could offer a better answer, but again, I just don't use mods. So move on to the last question, and that is why it feels hard and complicated to switch from Windows to Linux for some YouTubers' experience videos. Well, I'll start by saying that I think for the individual, it really depends on the person. For some, making the switch is easy, and for others, an absolute nightmare. It boils down to how willing the person is to learn, their willingness to read and research and educate themselves, how technical they are, and how patient they are. I have guides on this channel that walk you through installing Pop! OS, Arch, and Mint. It's a very easy process from where I'm sitting, and probably for most of you. A lot of you can install a distro with your eyes closed. But for someone with very little to no technical skills, it can be very daunting and intimidating, especially for someone who may have never installed an OS before, who's always bought pre-builts with Windows already on them. And one of the biggest issues, at least in my opinion, is that people have an aversion to change. A lot of people do, at least. Going from Windows to Linux, especially when you depend on your computer, is actually a pretty big deal and requires a bit of a learning curve, and that in itself can be intimidating to some people. And as mentioned before, some people have no patience and no desire to commit themselves to learning something new. That's just how it is. A lot of people may go into making the switch with low expectations because of all the disinformation and, let's face it, at times outright lies about Linux that they've heard. In other words, they've been misled to thinking that, just for example, that you can't game on Linux, when we all know that you actually can. So maybe, and this is just me spitballing here for a moment, they go into making a switch with a head full of all kinds of false notions, and invariably and inevitably run into problems in a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't know if I'm articulating my thoughts very well here. As for the YouTubers' experience videos, I avoid those like the plague, and y'all know the ones I'm talking about. The title of the video is always something like, I've used X for 5 years, but I'm switching to Y for 30 days, click to subscribe and see how it goes. Inevitably, the creator goes back to X because, of course, their channel is dedicated to making content about X. I personally find those types of videos to be relatively disingenuous. Let's face it, we all have biases, whether we want to admit it or not. I have biases and you have biases. I am biased in favor of Capcom. They make my all-time favorite game franchise. I'm biased in favor of AMD. I'm biased in favor of New York-style pizza over Chicago-style. We all have biases, and those biases can and often do subconsciously and at times even consciously affect our experiences when dealing with alternatives. So when a channel that is primarily about Windows or Mac OS or whatever makes a video about switching to Linux, I typically just avoid it, because I know that it's going to be, for the most part, disingenuous, whether intentionally or not. To kind of make my point, I did watch one of those I made the switch videos by one of my favorite content creators. I actually really do respect this person's work and I love their content. They are phenomenal. But this person is a longtime Android user and did one of the I'm going to switch to iPhone videos. This person is also very pro Android, so I expected them to pick apart all the bad things about iPhone, which I was not disappointed. But the one complaint they had that stood out to me was they complained that they couldn't move their cursor around freely like they could on Android. So after hearing this, I grabbed my iPhone, I pressed down and held my space bar, and lo and behold, I could move my cursor around freely just fine. To me, it came across as very disingenuous. Now, I know I've used that word a lot, and I don't think that they were being intentionally misleading. I just think their bias got in the way of an honest take. Or at least their bias convinced them that they didn't need to bother researching the complaint first. How does this tie into YouTubers' experience with making the switch? Well, as I said before, a lot of those creators have a bias in favor of Windows or Mac OS. Their channels are often dedicated to Windows or Mac OS. So they're going to, whether consciously or subconsciously, find and highlight the problems that they have, whether those problems are manufactured for the sake of content or not. And that favors their preferred OS. And of course, this will all be at the expense of Linux. You know, people have the right to watch what they want, and no one has the right to tell someone what they can or can't enjoy. But for me personally, I avoid the X versus Y, who wins, I tried X for 30 days, see what happens types of videos, because at least for me, they're mostly dishonest. All right, so that wraps up this impromptu video. I hope that it's shed some light on those questions and maybe answered them for a few of you, and some of you may disagree, and if you do disagree with my answers, please let me know in the comments below. So thank you again, and stay safe out there, and have a good one.